She didn't disappear because the world forgot her. She disappeared because the world never stopped looking. Brigitte Bardot didn't spend her final years chasing relevance, nostalgia, or redemption. Instead, she chose silence, nature, and a place so carefully protected that it became less a home and more a final refuge. This is not the story of how fame fades. This is the story of what happens after a person becomes a symbol too powerful to live inside. For decades, Bardot wasn't just famous, she was shorthand. Two letters, BB, were enough to describe an entire idea of freedom, youth, and rebellion. But the woman behind those initials eventually rejected everything they stood for. And that contradiction is where her final chapter truly begins. Because the same figure who helped redefine femininity in the 20th century would later choose isolation over applause, animals over people, and privacy over legacy. And according to publicly available accounts, she never looked back. But to understand why Brigitte Bardot ended her life in near-complete seclusion, we have to start at the moment when the world first lost control of her image. And it happened faster than anyone expected. In 1956, a film was released that didn't just provoke discussion, it disrupted an entire moral framework. And God Created Woman was not revolutionary because of what it showed, but because of what it suggested. A new kind of woman, one who moved freely, dressed casually, and appeared unconcerned with approval. Audiences weren't prepared, critics were openly hostile, and institutions reacted defensively. According to contemporary reporting, the film faced heavy resistance in several countries, including bans, delays, and public protests. In the United States, exhibitors reportedly clashed with censorship authorities. In Spain, the film would not be shown for more than a decade. But resistance only amplified the effect. Bardot's presence on screen was interpreted as a rupture, a visible shift away from rigid expectations that had defined femininity for generations. Without overt provocation, she became associated with personal autonomy, sensuality, and youth-led cultural change. And she was only 22. What made this moment unusual wasn't just the reaction, it was Bardot's apparent indifference to it. She didn't frame herself as a spokesperson. She didn't defend a movement. She didn't explain herself. She simply existed. And that, paradoxically, made her dangerous to systems built on explanation and control. Fashion followed almost immediately. Structured silhouettes gave way to simplicity. Ballet flats replaced heels. Loose hair replaced careful styling. According to fashion historians, Bardot's everyday appearance blurred the line between public image and private comfort in a way that felt radical at the time. But the cultural shift went deeper than clothing. Philosophers and intellectuals took notice, not to condemn, but to analyze. Simone de Beauvoir famously described Bardot as a force in women's history, emphasizing not provocation, but experience. The idea that a woman could engage with the world primarily through her senses, without apology, was unsettling and liberating in equal measure. Yet, while the public constructed meaning around her, Bardot herself remained uninterested in sustaining it. She openly rejected the rituals of fame. Red carpets, formal appearances, and traditional symbols of success reportedly made her uncomfortable. According to multiple interviews over the years, she viewed fame not as achievement, but as confinement. And nowhere was that tension more visible than in her personal relationships. Her romantic life became the subject of constant speculation, often exaggerated, sometimes mythologized. What remains consistent across credible sources is not the number of relationships, but the pattern. She resisted permanence, she resisted expectation, and she resisted being shaped into a role, even when that role benefited her.
Her marriage to filmmaker Roger Vadim placed her at the center of cultural change, but even that partnership was unstable. As her career accelerated, her private life became increasingly public and increasingly scrutinized. By the late 1960s, Bardot had achieved something rare: global recognition without institutional loyalty. She belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, unexpectedly, she stopped. In 1973, at just 38 years old, Brigitte Bardot announced her retirement from cinema. No farewell tour, no gradual transition. She simply walked away from the industry that had made her untouchable. At the time, many assumed it was temporary. It wasn't. From that moment on, Bardot began a transformation that would confuse, disappoint, and polarize those who still projected meaning on her image. She withdrew to La Madrague, her home in Saint-Tropez, a property that would eventually become synonymous with her final way of life. There, removed from the mechanisms of celebrity, she redirected her attention entirely. Not towards reinvention, not towards legacy management, but to something far more absolute: animals. According to her own statements and long-standing public work, Bardot found in animal rights activism a sense of purpose she felt fame had never provided. She established a foundation, funded campaigns, and became one of the most visible advocates for animal welfare in France. But this new role came with consequences. As her public statements grew sharper, her relationship with society became increasingly strained. Bardot's rhetoric, particularly in later years, was widely criticized, and she became a controversial figure within her own country. Courts would later rule against several of her statements, and her public image dramatically shifted. The woman once celebrated as a symbol of liberation was now discussed as a figure of contradiction. And rather than clarify or soften her stance, Bardot chose withdrawal. She stopped giving interviews regularly. She limited access. She fortified her privacy. La Madrague became less a residence and more a boundary, a space where the world ended and her chosen reality began. By her own account, she felt closer to nature than to people. And that choice, more than any headline, defines how Brigitte Bardot spent her final years. Not chasing the past, not repairing her image, but refusing to negotiate with a world that never stopped asking her to explain herself. And what remains unresolved is whether this retreat was an act of peace or the final consequence of a freedom that went too far to return. What followed Bardot's retreat was not silence in the traditional sense. It was distance. Distance from cameras, distance from expectation, and increasingly, distance from the cultural movement she once symbolized. From La Madrague, Bardot constructed a life governed by strict boundaries. According to publicly available accounts, access to her property became tightly controlled. Journalists were discouraged. Uninvited visitors were turned away. The Mediterranean landscape, once a backdrop for leisure, became a form of protection. This wasn't nostalgia, it was refusal. Refusal to perform memory. Refusal to soften opinions for public comfort. Refusal to live as an artifact of her own past. And yet, paradoxically, the further she withdrew, the more intensely she was discussed. Her activism for animal rights grew more uncompromising over time. Bardot did not frame her cause in abstract terms. She spoke emotionally, sometimes harshly, and often without the diplomatic restraint expected of public figures. Supporters described her as fearless. Critics described her as extreme. Both sides agreed on one thing: she no longer cared how she was perceived. But this phase of her life also revealed a tension that many found difficult to reconcile. Bardot, once associated with breaking social constraints, now expressed views that were widely seen as exclusionary. Legal consequences followed, public debate intensified, and the image of BB fractured into incompatible interpretations. For some, she remained an icon of artistic and cultural liberation. For others, she became a cautionary figure, someone who challenged norms only to later defend rigid boundaries of her own. What makes this transformation difficult to simplify is that Bardot never attempted to resolve it for the audience. She did not issue comprehensive explanations. She did not seek reconciliation with her critics. In interviews she did grant, she often dismissed the need to justify herself at all. In her words, the past version of herself no longer felt familiar. That admission matters, because it reframes the question, not why did Brigitte Bardot change, but what does it mean when a symbol refuses continuity? Most public figures spend their later years managing perception. Bardot dismantled it. By stepping away from cinema,